Thank you so much, Bobby. I didn't realize how troublesome my bio was. And thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you to John, thank you to Karen, thank you to the whole team here at GSA for facilitating me being up here. I'm just up for 24 hours, but it's nice to be back in Glasgow in lots of ways, and hard in lots of ways. So yeah, I'm going to try and keep to time throughout this presentation. It's some kind of research that I've been involving during my PhD and began during my master's at Goldsmiths. And they're conversations that I continue to kind of have, so I'm really excited about hearing from all of you and sharing different ways that we kind of get through with as much empowerment and pleasure as possible. So I'll just crack on. So this presentation considers the ways in which both the potentiality for and imagination of black futures on the African continent are cancelled out by contemporary discourses and policies of Euro-American states whose colonial legacy has erased so many black histories. I use speculative frameworks of queer feminist science fiction and decolonial black poetics to respond to these totalizing narratives and environmental violences of climate colonialism, as well as to ask questions of my own that feel integral to my own survival and legacy. In her most recent book, Staying with the Trouble, Making Kin in the Tudor Scene, feminist theorist Donna Haraway cites SF, here incorporating speculative fabulation, science fact, and speculative feminism to discuss climate change as a method of tracing, of following a thread in the dark, in a dangerous true tale adventure where who lives and who dies and how might become clearer for cultivating multi-species justice. SF is practice and process. It is becoming with each other in surprising relays. And Haraway's notion of becoming with is crucial to the rafts of speculative possibility I hope that we might construct over the next 2 hours and lifetimes. Dot Haraway writes, staying with the trouble requires making oddkin. That is, we require each other in unexpected collaborations and combinations in hot compost piles. We become with each other or not at all. And in this research, I engage a methodology of something that is kind of termed a vulnerable, affective, and queer engagement with climate change, a kind of vulnerable mode of writing. So it thinks about kind of what that means in terms of how the research is enacted, but also how I stand here as a theorist, as an activist, as a speculative writer, in all my kind of privilege, and as well as my intersecting relationships to oppression. This is a particularly vulnerable location for me to present, given that this is only the second time that I've returned to Glasgow after studying here at the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland, during which I experienced a brutal emotional breakdown as a result of inordinate layers of racism and penalisation, both generally moving through public space and on my course, where in a particularly memorable exercise, I was asked to stand on a chair in an all-white class whilst another student pretended to sell me as a slave at an auction. And I was asked to try and feel how that would have felt. In the 10-minute walk since I arrived from Glasgow Central Station, I was also welcomed home. Welcome back to Glasgow by this sign. I'm bringing this up in order to state right now and upfront that you are all as implicated in this mess as I am, and that whilst my research focused on sub-Saharan Africa, there are many dissident, accidental, and forced crossings over, disruptions and complications of what Professor Stuart Hall termed the West and the rest, which is to say that there are many of us, the rest, here within the so-called West, and not just in London. So whilst I spend a lot of my research looking at images like this, and also like this, not only do we know that climate change will and has affected Scotland over the last decades, challenging many species across the country, some of whom can only live in the warming Upper Highlands or Northern Islands, as well as human life, changing these gorgeous sweeping landscapes forever. but the effects of Scotland's economic and political footprints are still being felt across the globe. For example, as I'm sure many of you know, much of the city's wealth, and in particular Merchant City, was largely built on profits from the transatlantic slave trade, the forced labour of which quite literally powered the Industrial Revolution across North and South America, which has gone on to cause climate change in the first place. Not to mention what just last autumn Theresa May called the, quote, vast opportunities for Scotland's North Sea sector offered by oil and gas exploration in Africa. So instead of images like this, I thought I'd play some rather exquisite images of the Scottish Highlands to bring this conversation around climate colonialism, which can so often feel like it's about over there, a bit closer to home. Let's see if it works. Exciting. Oh, advert. Capitalism. Okay, thank you to whoever this person is who made this very nice montage of the Scottish Highlands. Here then, utilising a feminist methodology of vulnerable writing as the framework with which to consider the reclamatory exploration of an often primitivized culture and an often exoticized body. I'll be looking at the visual activist a bit later on, Zanele Moholi, who is a South African photographer, organizer, kind of general. They've become a really kind of interesting, iconic figure, which I think is somewhat problematic, and I think we've had some interesting chats, Zanele and I, about that. Moholi themselves has commented, I'm reclaiming my blackness, which I feel is continuously performed by the privileged other. Vulnerability becomes an opportunity for empowerment here rather than weakness, for reclamation rather than disembodiment. A methodology of feminist vulnerable writing abjures the reaction that a paternal and or patriarchal state is required to protect the vulnerable body's environment from that which endangers them, as this denies the autonomy and resistance of that body from its shifting and complex positions and vulnerabilities. Vulnerability as methodology with relation to climate change, therefore, consistently avoids the language of protection, preservation, and restriction, rather attempting to foster an environment in which fragility and broken are merely entry points, cracks through which a kaleidoscope of futures become possible, as opposed to a homogeneous and limited viewfinder in which words like African, female, black, and queer equate to words like desertification, famine, erosion, civil war, and massacre. Such terms dehumanize the black body and depoliticize climate change, divorcing it from its colonial legacy and the contemporary accountability of Euro-American institutions of political, economic, and actually I'd add educational power. Ooh. So, meaning we are back to images like this. Further to this, I attempt to engage decolonial vulnerable writing inspired by what Fred Moten and Steve Harney are taking up in the Undercommons as a methodological approach. Quote, to inhabit the ruptural and enraptured disclosure of the commons that fugitive enlightenment enacts. The criminal, matricidal, queer, in the cistern, on the stroll of the stolen life, the life stolen by enlightenment and stolen back, where the commons give refuge, where the refuge gives commons. Decolonial vulnerable writing is a methodological double agent, taking that which was stolen by enlightenment, autonomous fractious modes of being, and working to refract homogeneous dehumanization. In other words, quote, vulnerability implicates us in what is beyond us, yet part of us. It's okay. I thought it was the video. Is it the video? It's a phone. That's fine. I was like, is YouTube just, hacking me right now? In other words, vulnerability implicates us in what is beyond us, yet part of us, constituting one central dimension of what might tentatively be called our embodiment. That's a quote from Tiffany Page, who's a feminist theorist who writes really interestingly on vulnerable writing. The 3 pieces of Moholy's work I have chosen to include here can be seen as manifestations of this embodiment, powerful in its vulnerability. Together we seek a break to think through climate change and urge an opportunity for the extinction of patriarchal neocolonialism rather than the completion of its project, after which, as sonic critic and visual cultural theorist Kojo Eshin stated in a talk in 2017 in Goldsmiths University, we are all silenced, or sick, or assimilated, or dead. Our impulse as undercover agents, feminists, ecologists, queer, disabled, trans, black, brown, and indigenous peoples within the great institution of Euro-America, towards academia and away from the emotional responses so often employed by colonialism and patriarchy to silence and ridicule us, must now be forced to rupture. When our perception is warped by the disavowal of a historic lineage, the understanding that we are not born onto an equal playing field upon which the American dream and its international equivalents are enacted, but rather into the hands of inherited trauma, privilege, complexity, and international relations, our emotions are then often stifled and misdirected. And this in turn misdirects our action. For example, during the 2015 floods in Yorkshire, the British media focused not on the realities of climate change, now manifesting in northern England, but rather on the black and brown migrants whom they denoted would put even more strain on public health services. So these 2 are both headlines from the Daily Mail from 2015. This is actually from 2013, but it was so horrific that I just felt like I needed to add it in. There is an urgency in disrupting this framework, which escalates the conditions of slow violence Black and Indigenous communities are currently living under globally. Multiplying the 300,000 people, it is estimated, already die every year from climate change-related issues, to a predicted 182 million sub-Saharan African deaths by the end of the century, topping the most dire estimations of the amount of enslaved Africans who died from chattel slavery, by the way, which ranges from 9 to 20 to 150 million. So what is climate change? Obviously, if you were here at the last event, you kind of know this, so I'll just skim through it, but I think it's really important to kind of go back and be like, what is this thing? Because it becomes a buzzword, it becomes something that I think there is a lot of books to read about it, and often if you miss the kind of 101, you kind of get thrown in at the deep end. So I'm just going to run over the basics. From a scientific perspective, the term climate change can be understood as an abrupt increase in the Earth's temperature, known as global warming. This doesn't mean everywhere is getting hotter at the same time, or at the same rate, or even getting hotter at all. But the Earth's temperature is generally getting warmer. So 16 of the 17 last years on record, warmest years of record have appeared in this young century, and it looks like this year might be one of them, given yesterday's 20-degree February heat wave in London. And I hear 13-degree heat wave in Glasgow. I remember that. The majority of climate scientists agree that climate change is due to an increased consumption by human beings since the Industrial Revolution and the subsequently high quantities of greenhouse gases we have released into the atmosphere. The main sources of GHGs, according to a 2008 report by the European Environmental Agency, are the burning of fossil fuels, so coal, oil and gas, in electricity generation, transport, industry and households, agriculture and land use changes like deforestation, landfilling waste, and the use of industrial fluorinated gases, and also hydraulic fracturing, known as fracking. GHGs cause the Earth's surface temperature to rise, and climate scientists fear an increase of between 4 and 6 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. So the kind of COP focus on 2 degrees is extremely unlikely, and 2 degrees for Europe equals something like 3.5 degrees at least for most of sub-Saharan Africa, which, agriculturally speaking, is a death sentence for most of the continent. Some climate scientists are talking about 8 degrees. So the African continent, a 4-degree rise would result in 40% less rainfall and the shrinkage of up to 90 of croplands, with remaining agriculture subject to escalated mycetosin levels, which will increase food spoilage and decrease food security. Salinized soil, sometimes to toxic levels, affects nutrition, whilst an increase in droughts, high winds and floods leads to an intensification of injury, disease and malnutrition, putting pressure on already strained access to and provision of public health care and support. So despite being one of the continents that's least responsible for climate change, it continues to be hit the hardest. It's actually responsible for less than 4% of the world's annual greenhouse gas emissions, the whole continent. Equally, a global surface temperature does not reflect the same level of increase in all parts of the world. In his essay Forensis in 2015, forensic architecture Adrian Lahoud unpacks floating bodies of particles that make up the maps of oceanic and atmospheric transport used to chart where climate change impacts most severely. He notes, quote, because the mechanics of climate form a complicated transport system redistributing the effects of pollution according to a process that is non-linear and transboundary, the space of violation is separated from the space of its repercussion. Those least responsible for carbon emissions will be the most susceptible to drought and rising sea levels. So in other words, because of this process of chemical dissemination, GHGs that are emitted in one part of the world do not stay there, nor are the effects of those emissions felt by those that produce them, or of course increasingly we are feeling them, but not at the same rate and not with the same severity, and we don't have the same systems, or we have different systems to deal with them. The term climate colonialism, then, was an accusation returned to the world's highest GHG emitters at the 2009 climate summit in Copenhagen, known as COP21. It attempts to encapsulate this political and cultural moment in which there is little to no accountability held by Euro-America with regards to the global power dynamics of domination and oppression that neocolonial capitalism continues to reinscribe, manifested through the effects of climate change upon both the economies and peoples of the global south. Climate colonialism, by my definition, is the inherent disparity with which the global south is being forced to pay economically, ecologically, and in lives and croplands in comparison to the global north. It also refers to the siphoning of natural resources at unsustainably high rates using ecologically volatile methods such as hydraulic fracturing or fracking within economies that have been historically and contemporarily hampered by post-colonial stipulations such as the structural adjustment programs, which left much of Africa so quote-unquote indebted to Europe. Many countries' economies and environments in the global south were already, in some cases cataclysmically altered by colonial occupation. So one of the things that I'm researching now is the protectionist movements across West Africa and how they were kind of used to not only kind of support different movements of deforestation, but also to kind of co-opt so-called sacred land that was already being protected by different agricultural practices and beliefs. And yet, no longer can the repercussions of the colonies be said to only be felt over there. What writer and activist Naomi Klein called the sacrificial zones of climate colonialism are expanding. So in contrast to this idea of climate colonialism that we're expressing here today, which is not a widely discussed topic, I'm really happy this is happening, we might take the far more popular articulation of something called the Anthropocene, which is coined by the Dutch atmospheric chemist Paul Crutzen, who is there, who simply stated, for the past 3 centuries, the effects of humans on the global environment have escalated. Because of these anthropogenic emissions of carbon dioxide, global climate may depart significantly from natural behavior for many millennia to come. And this is relevant because this kind of depoliticized language, which kind of presents that climate change is something that just happened, it was just a natural progression that just happened, is really the kind of tone that we're seeing happening across, whether it's political engagement, engagement by the media, educational engagement. It's really being taught in this kind of there is no cause, it's just an effect that we're now kind of happening to deal with, but it'll all be fine kind of tone. This inherently depoliticized statement, which associates anthropogenic emissions with global climate, has gone on to play a vital role in discourses across the disciplines of ecology and cultural studies, as well as later post-colonial theory, feminist theory, and writing, and more. The article incited many cultural critiques of his depoliticized homogeneity, however, amongst other theorists, Zoe Todd, who's an amazing Indigenous scholars theorist based in Canada. I would argue that notwithstanding succinct arguments by Zoe Todd and others, there are many others, the very existence of the Anthropocenic debate in its complete disregard of othered human and non-human life relies heavily on this dichotomy of the white other, north, south. And this is just an artwork that I wanted to bring into the space. It's called Is Our World Sustainable? And it's by Bakary Emmanuel Daou, who's a Malian artist. In Art and the Anthropocene, encounters among aesthetics, politics, environments, and epistemologies, which I really recommend, Zoe Todd illustrates the alienation she feels as a, quote, space invader, which is a term that's used by Nimmo Puar, in the white institutional art world. Here she explains, quote, real, high, or accepted art, and, quote, is made by the opinions of white institutions and their white gatekeepers, in much the same way that the Anthropocenic discourse inherently centers the cis white male body and continues in the footsteps of colonialism to denormalize or hypernaturalize the indigenous body. Now I want to turn to some of the alternative, speculative ideations of black, queer, and decolonial climate change futures that really fuel my research, because even though the first half of this conversation has probably been incredibly depressing, my research really looks at kind of alternative pleasure practices, aesthetic ideation, science fiction that is written, that is created through collage, and it's something that I became interested in partly from my background in the arts, but also because my mental health was becoming obliterated by studying climate change and climate colonialism, particularly as a black woman and as a West African, going home regularly and seeing where I'm from disappear on a daily basis. So I've been researching a fairly wide range of visual artists, writers and filmmakers from across the continent, and particularly Ghana and Kenya, which is my two areas of research. But this evening I'm going to explore 3 photographs from the South African visual activist who I introduced earlier, Zanele Maholi, and her new series, Somnyama Ngunyama, which is Zulu for Hail the Dark Lioness. Utilizing Bell Hook's notion of the oppositional gaze, which I'll define in a moment, Ursula K. Le Guin's carrier bag theory of fiction, I here reflect on how Maholi's photography, Bobby, that was contagious, holds the West to account. I consider whether it is possible to align the violences enacted upon queer black bodies with the violences enacted upon the earth in light of centuries of discourse in which the hypernaturalization of blackness was used to justify years of colonial enslavement, exploitation, and appropriation, which continues today. Returning to Judith Butler's theorization on vulnerability as a means for mobilization, it is necessary to think through how Maholi's visual activism plays with vulnerability as empowerment, confrontation, and testimony. This section ends by considering how Maholi's work begins to offer itself up as a carrier bag, a raft upon which to traverse the barrier reefs of climate change into a future free, perhaps, not only of racism, but one in which race itself is no longer imprisoning. This is not an art historical critique of Maholi's work, rather it reads with the photography as visualizations of decolonial queer resistance in the face of genocide. In this ongoing self-portrait series, Maholi often appears naked, exposed, and equally exposes us to this oppositional gaze. Confronting the viewers directly, Maholi plays with the vulnerability of her nudity, her surroundings, her alternatingly female, masculine, non-binary, and alien human black body, here reclaiming the potentiality of alien as radical. Surrounding us in a high contrast exposure of pain and accusation, familiarity, connection, possibility, resilience, resistance, but always vulnerability. When the queer body, as much as the cisgendered female, have historically been associated with vulnerability, fragility, and weakness, terms often defined by the oppressor interchangeably, where is the position of strength, reflexivity, and sustainability in vulnerability as a form of activism, or as that which is in some sense mobilized in forms of resistance? Moholy commented in a recent interview with Autograph ABP senior curator René Moussai, discussing the opening of their new show at that London gallery. My practice as a visual activist looks mainly at Black resistance, existence as well as insistence. Most of the work I've done over the years focuses exclusively on Black LGBTQI people, making sure we exist in the visual archive. But in this series, I wanted to use my face so that people will always remember just how important our Black faces are when confronted by them. And as much as I would like a person to see themselves in Somnyama, I needed it to be my own portraiture. I didn't want to expose another person to this pain. The first piece I'm reflecting on is titled Kwanele, Parktown, 2016. Kwanele, if translated from isiZulu to English, means simply enough. In Skin Deep magazine, issue 2, Imagining 2043, Maya Magrandilal writes, quote, "The future belongs to monsters. They will be queer, Black, aliens, trans, everything. In the monster future, there will be such a thing as enough and such a thing as too much. And everyone will have the former and no one will have the latter." It's enough. Enough of a plastic wrapper for a headdress, enough chemical-spilled oceans, enough burning of carrier bags, enough electronic waste that will never decompose, enough desertification, enough brown bodies on the shoreline, enough polystyrene saran-wrapped suitcases, everything I could grab in a moment, abandoned at the immigration center. Enough, enough, enough. How many more times must I say, Kwanele, it's enough, before what you hear is not more, but too much? Moholy's eyes look back at us from Kwanele, Parktown, 2016. They are old, they are tired, they have known too much pain. I think about areas of the earth that have been subjected to violent hydraulic fracturing, such as the Karoo region in South Africa, or the repeated toxic oil spills in the Ogoniland region near the Niger Delta, manifestations of climate colonialism. If those lands had eyes, I believe they would look like this. In this work, Moholy returns to what Hooks defined as the oppositional gaze in 1992. Quote, "By courageously looking, we defiantly declared, not only will I stare, I want my look to change reality." End quote. Even in the worst circumstances of domination, the ability to manipulate one's gaze in the face of structures of domination that would contain it opens up the possibility of agency. Kwanele mutates that opportunity for agency, making it larger than life. In the gallery, the photograph magnifies Nele's face to almost 3 times its actual size. Moholy and the polystyrene saran wrapper become monstrous in their refusal to decompose. The sediments of colonialism, technological mass production, and forced migration come back to haunt us with eyes that cannot be closed. There is power in looking, Hooks tells us. And Moholy uses that power and implicates us with this gaze. Moholy knows who is looking, who occupies so much of the white art world that consumes their image. They accuse that audience. They do not only invade space so much as occupy it, attempting to critique and contaminate their own complicity within the depoliticized trend of Black art. And yet, Moholy tells us, they tell us too that they are tired, that there is vulnerability in that inherited and lived exhaustion of oppression, but that they will not stop. They will not stop in their accusations. They will not stop looking. In Bekisisa Sakuli Beach, Mayotte, 2016, Moholy offers a very different engagement with the environment, and it's one of the few pieces in the series, which is over 70 photographs, where Moholy denies us their gaze or relieves us of it. Bekisisa meaning look closely, or look again. You have to look closely and look again to see more than the beach, to find this androgynous body amidst the stones. Is it resting there on the rocks? Has it been washed ashore as so many black and brown bodies meet stony European beaches, bloated and unconsenting, ebbing and flowing throughout history and news channels and inherited nightmares or memories of bodies that look like ours, looking like this? Has it been cast aside, following the murderous pilgrimage of black lesbians in South Africa, battered and abandoned in fields and on street sides, torn Bible pages saturated in homophobia litter the ground, imported like capitalism and Coca-Cola from the neo-colonial West? Has it descended there from another dimension, planet, timeline, solar system? A queer black alien come to rescue, if not humankind, then perhaps the Earth, as in Octavia Butler's Exogenesis series? Did it drag itself from the waves to meet terrestrial land-bound life, as in Nnedi Okorafor's Lagoon? Is it a queer black mermaid, a dugong, divulging its secret other form? Is it merely making acquaintance with the pebbles upon which it rests, hearing of how they used to be mountains? Of the violence they have witnessed, of the corrosion that has scarred them and moved them and made them beautiful, of the stillness. I see in this image a healing, a suturing with a ruptured, resistant earth. I'm filled with a kind of queer desire, perhaps a craving even for that oversimplification, that grafting from one damaged organism to another, from which both might receive sap or salve and heal without scars. Bekisisa is both an arrival and a return, just as so many climate migrants from colonized countries are both arriving and returning to European shores, some alive, some already ancestors. Moholy inserts herself into the compost pile of the beach, so often a container of debris, of shrapnel, a place where eroded things, ground down, misshapen, and fused to alien matter become hybridized. I think of Ursula K. Le Guin's carrier bag theory of fiction and consider that Moholy opens herself up here as the carrier bag, a canvas for futures in which humans are not so different, greater or lesser than the earth they live with rather than upon. Such a future could be carried in, quote, a leaf, a gourd, a shell, a net, a bag, a sling, a sack, a bottle, a pot, a box, a container, a holder, a recipient, a collectively cherished and maintained pouch of fertile seeds, the rocks, the beach, my yacht itself, and hold Moholy, and in turn they are as resistant and resilient invocation of a story not dominated by the sticks and spears and swords, the things to bash and poke and hit with, the long hard things. Bekisisa queers and decolonizes the very possibilities of the parameters in which the human and non-human can meet. According to Le Guin, it is the container that first enabled sustainable human life. Long before the bashing and killing, Le Guin explains, there must have been something to gather the grains and berries in. Not just enough grains for now, not a handful for later, but more. Grains for the elderly who could not leave the cave or settlement or village or encampment. Grains for the young, grains for the winter, grains for the future. No one, Le Guin laments, wants to tell that story, wants to hear that story, the slower, more careful, more thoughtful story, without any long, hard things. Sustainability is in the very nature of the carrier bag. It does not make sense to pick all of the oats now, as then there will be none left for next year. It is useful to think through Le Guin's carrier bag theory of fiction, itself built upon Elizabeth Fisher's carrier bag theory of human evolution, with relation to black queer interjections in the climate change narrative, as the work itself makes those interjections. I think of the far disseminated proverb, water is life, now more apt than ever. Bekisisa seems thirsty. In 2016, South Africa had to direct 381 million rand towards drought relief. In that same year, the country committed to begin a controversial hydraulic fracturing project requiring an estimated 57 million gallons of highly pressurized water. And you might have heard about some of the droughts and rationings taking place in Cape Town last year. In Moholy's story, the 821 million lives that we heard about at the beginning become individualized and named. Quote, faces that disturb, the perpetrator, end quote. They become opportunities and choices rather than unavoidable inevitabilities. In that narrative, there are options that do not lead us to an 8-degree rise in carbon emissions. In that story, the future is what we make it. And we, the marginalized, as well as they, the mainstream corporate states, have choices over who lives and who dies and how. Both Bekisisa and Kwanele do not portray an aftermath, but a terrifyingly consuming now. They entreat us to, quote, stay with the trouble of climate colonialism. And in that being present, we find pain, rest, resistance, resilience. But studying and living through climate change makes escape artists of us all, continually what Naomi Klein has called looking away, rather than looking closely or looking again. As Black queer writers, scholars, activists, artists, we're all mixed up with desires and queerness, oil spills and broken mountains, riding science fiction lifeboats from a nuclear waste compost pile littered with wet fecund seeds. In an act of self-preservation, our mental health scrambles together a raft of the speculative and sets sail for the end of the world, longing to plant a beginning there rather than live through the responsibility of staying here in an ending and fighting for our queer bodies discarded on the beach. In a final hybridization of the oppositional gaze and a kind of Treborgian eco-creolization, I would like to evoke one of Moholy's most recent works in the series, Zabo, 2017, taken in Kyoto, Japan. Here, enclosed in a Japanese bonsai tree, I find it possible to read a blackness that has transcended flesh, when Moholy becomes an extension of the tree itself. She said, I wanted to create that confusion where you see nothing apart from my eyeballs and you have to look for the body, contesting the way of scrutiny. In this instance, I am taking control to say, look for me, and when you find that body, what do you see? What are you even looking at or looking for, rather? It was my dream to be part of that environment. I wanted to remember me as a part of that cluster. End quote. As with Kwanele in the gallery, exhibited as a floor-to-ceiling wall vinyl, the bonsai tree, traditionally conservatively pruned, and the eyeballs inside it have grown monstrous in proportion, yet a softer gaze looks out at us now, one that almost looks beyond us, and I consider this Moholy's future gaze, in a series that is born of and from so much pain and violence, of enforced awareness. You have to be mindful all the time, Moholy says, when you are in certain spaces because of your positionality, because of what others expect you to be, or because your culture is continuously misrepresented. For me, this work challenges our obsession with the continued existence of the Black body as Black. It is a fixation impressed upon us, and it is also one that we cannot seem to live without. Zabo penetrates a futurity deep inside, something that we must all cling onto, for only by dreaming beyond and beyond the oppressions of today can we nurture a generation of life prepared to live without them tomorrow. And I'm going to skip a little bit. As Samuel R. Delaney writes, we need images of tomorrow, and our people need them more than most. Without an image of tomorrow, one is trapped by blind history, economics, and politics beyond our control. One is tied up in a web, in a net, with no way to struggle free. Only by having clear and vital images of the many alternatives, good and bad, of where one can go, will we have any control over the way we might actually get there in a reality tomorrow will bring all too quickly. In conclusion, then, I would argue that as Moholy insists, as Jose Esteban Munoz insists, queerness is essentially about the rejection of a here and now and an insistence on the potentiality or concrete possibility for another world. Queerness exists within the realm of impossibility and precarity, and it is this inherent vulnerability that not only allows, but often forces it or us to act from states of extreme oppression. As Moholy becomes the carrier bag, Queerness becomes the raft that will carry her and the stories she cradles. It is for this reason that I have bound up my raft of future envisioning and decolonial strategies of piercing climate colonialism with queerness. It is in the nature of queerness to survive all necropolitical states, but it must be the nature of futurity to exist beyond survival, to consider the urgent and unwavering desire and necessity for livability, that is, conditions in which life can thrive beyond the bare life parameters of survival, for livable tomorrows. Through the cracks and breaks of decolonial black poetics and SF, climate colonialism is brought into the limelight. Colonization and queer futurity provide an environment conducive not only for the completion of the neocolonial and heteronormative agenda, but also for its abolition. The work of Moholi's uncategorizable form on the beach of Mayotte, an island that's very existence is threatened by human pollution and the rising sea levels of climate change, exists in transit between this world and the possibilities of history forgotten and the futures we must begin to imagine, quote, beyond inherited categories and capacities. And from imagining to build. I think I cut that out, but it's such a beautiful quote, we can just leave it there for a minute. During the writing of this study, let's see if we can get another advert. No, because Vimeo is great. During the writing of this study, the Great Barrier Reef, home to 1,625 types of fish, was declared dead due to climate change. But further research reveals this is not actually true. It has been battered by rising sea temperatures and acidification due to local farmers using chemical fertilizers, which then go into the surrounding waters, but the reef could still recover. In a recent interview, local marine biologist Doug Baird commented, quote, "What is happening now is what we call assisted evolution," end quote. Looking at strategies for restoration and repair rather than just managing the marine park. I find this notion of assisted evolution helpful when thinking through active responses to climate colonialism, because it reminds me that the world doesn't just happen the way it happens. We assist, desist, insist, and or resist. We make choices. We choose to act, or we choose not to. Futurity will come into being with or without humankind. A reality tomorrow will bring all too quickly. And that reality remains thus. If we wish humankind to survive in some form other than bunkers full of the predominantly rich, white, racist, trans, homophobic, cis 1%, if we, queer, brown, marginal, disabled peoples, want to be envisioned in the images of tomorrow, we must challenge all that has ever been made possible to us. As Munoz incites, the future is queerness's domain. We must not only dream dangerously, but live dangerously, daring to build without the security of capitalism or heteronormativity. We must think beyond or think behind, remembering ways people used to think and have continued to fight and to think, as Klein, Haraway, and others have demonstrated. We can assist Odkin evolutions and realize science-fictional modes of relation to one another and the non-human with which we live. In conclusion, then, whether it is our role to reimagine, re-become what cohesive, human, humane existence after the West-dominated Anthropocene can look like, or to gracefully bow out and let another species take its shot, every action matters now. The how, the why, the who for, the who by, the for whom, and the for what. It matters how we live, die, survive, and imagine. It matters that we resist. Thank you.